51. Malachi predicts the Levitical priesthood would become corrupt. Malachi is the last prophet of the Old Testament, and he gives us a bleak picture of the state of the Levitical priesthood during his time, which was 500 years before Christ's ministry. The priesthood was doomed due to mixing with the surrounding peoples. Prior to Malachi, the prophets Nehemiah and Ezra had already encountered this same problem and tried to stop it. Nehemiah had read the law and then forced the peoples and the priests to separate from their mixed wives, where he read the law and they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent, and this would include mixed wives and children. However, this separation did not last, and by Ezra's time we had the same problem. The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites had not separated from the people of the lands, and this included all the abominable people, the Canaanites, the Kenites, and all the offshoots of their branches. So Ezra describes this as the holy seed had mingled themselves with the people of those lands. So we see clearly that this is a mixing problem. Astonishing today, it is taught that the problem was their wives were pagans, anything but race. These mixed people would eventually claim to be the Israelites centuries later. Malachi chapter 1 explains the final consequences of this in the end times. However, before getting to that, we must begin with Malachi chapter 2. It prophesies the inevitable dialogue that would transpire between Christ confronting the mixed people claiming to be Israelites, and they would say, "Have we not all one Father? Have not one God created us?" So here we see the mixed people would argue with Yahweh, with Christ, and claim that they are not mixed, that they are descended from the same Father. And this confrontation is recorded in John's Gospel, and if we examine the words carefully, we see that Christ rejected them. In John's Gospel, the Pharisees and other adversaries of Christ who are descended from Jacob's brother are stalking and hounding Christ, and Christ in a nutshell explains, "You do not believe because you are not my sheep." So the reason they rejected him is because they weren't truly Israelites. Christ explains to the true Israelites, "Therefore Yeshua said to those Judeans who believed him, If you abide in my word, truly you are my students, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." So here the descendants of Jacob's brother, the Pharisees, insist they are Israelites, and they replied, "We are the offspring of Abraham, and to no one have we been in bondage ever yet. How do you say that we shall be made free?" So the Israelites had been in bondage several times under the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. So by stating they had never been in bondage, they slip up here. These impostors were ignorant of their supposed history and false identity that they were claiming. Now Christ responds, and it must be read carefully, "I know that you are the offspring of Abraham, but you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you." The descendants of Jacob's brother were partially descended from Abraham, but they were also mixed in with the race of Cain. They were evil and despised Christ. This fact trips most Christians up. They never considered that Jacob's brother was also descended from Abraham. Now we have Malachi's exact prophecies, as Christ's adversaries fully understood what Christ was getting at and denied it. Then they said to him, "We were not born of fornication. We have one Father, Yahweh." So they are claiming, as Malachi predicted, that they're not mixed. They are pure Israelites and are descended from Yahweh, from the same Father. So now Christ explains who their true Father is and why they cannot and can never understand his words. "For what reason do you not perceive my speech? Because you are not able to hear my word. You are the sons of a father, the false accuser, i.e. the devil, and you wish to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning," so that's Cain, "and did not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh from his own devices, because he is a liar and his father." Christ is explaining that Cain is their true father from a fallen angel. Christ then adds, "He who is from of Yahweh hears the word of Yahweh. For this reason you do not hear, because you are not from of Yahweh." Later in Malachi chapter 2, it gives us further background information into the events leading up to Judea becoming a melting pot. "Judah have dealt treacherously, an abomination he has committed in Israel and in Jerusalem, for Judah have profaned the holiness of the Lord, which he loved, and have married the daughter of a strange god." This is a double prophecy, as the real Judah did this. However, it is also predicting that the Judea nation as a whole would forcefully convert surrounding peoples, particularly the descendants of Jacob's brother. And as we've explained previously, Josephus gives us an account of this. Hyrcanus took also Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea, and subdued all the Idumeans and permitted them to stay in the country if they would submit to circumcision. Now importantly, turning back to Malachi chapter 1, it explains our current situation. Yahweh predicts far off in the future the real Israelites, the Europeans, would care more about the impostors posing as Israelites than themselves. I have loved you, saith the Lord. Yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother? Saith the Lord, yet I loved Jacob. Then the prophecy corrects the Israelites, and Yahweh explains his attitude, and therefore the attitude we should have. And I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. So the descendants of Jacob's brother did merge with the Judeans, but eventually all the land was destroyed by the Romans, causing them to disperse. So they never disappeared, and they never gave up that false identity of being the Judeans. Next, Malachi prophesies is that sometime in the future, the descendants of Jacob's brother would claim to be persecuted and return to rebuild the lands of Judea. And of course, Yahweh says that he will ultimately destroy it, but it will be called the border of wickedness. So this prophecy can only be the recent return in the 20th century of the people who moved back to the land. Yahweh describes this new nation as a border of wickedness and the people against whom the Lord had indignation forever, even 2,000 years after Christ. So here the descendants of Jacob's brother have a false identity and wear a false mask. So many of our people who seek the truth will scour through so-called conspiracy theories. They will get partial truths, but ultimately never quite understand what is going on in the world. If they understood what Malachi is teaching about the gradual decay of Judea leading to Christ, why he even had adversaries to begin with, and why he rebuked, rejected, and condemned the all, the end-time consequences of the real Israelites being blind and deceived, and impostors masquerading under our identity, then our people's overall perspective would change, and they would finally understand what is truly going on in the world. 52. The prophecies about Jacob and Esau and their descendants. The entire Bible evolves around the two seed lines, the Adamites versus the Nephilim, which is described as the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Of course, Cain and his descendants would be included with the Nephilim. However, from Isaac onwards, his two sons would take the reins of these two races. Jacob's descendants, the Israelites, would supplant the Adamic family, whilst Jacob's brother's descendants would supplant the Nephilim. Ultimately, the whole world would become Jacob versus his brother, and they were chosen to be the two heads to represent the two races in an eternal war until Christ returns and destroys his enemies once and for all. Firstly, this is prophesied to Rebekah, who was pregnant with her twins, Jacob and Esau. And Yahweh said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. So Rebekah's twins would grow to become distinct nations and be against each other. Jacob would be the dominant nation. However, Esau was the eldest. Naturally, should he not have inherited the birthright, therefore became the greater of the 2 brothers? Well, we see in Genesis 25 that Esau had very little regard for his birthright and sold it to Jacob for a mere pot of stew, and this is where he is renamed to Edom. Furthermore, Esau took Canaanite wives. Now, his grandfather Abraham had specifically sent his servant Eliezer thousands of miles to find a wife for his father Isaac, a wife of the same race and kindred as Abraham's family. So Esau must have understood this, but completely disregarded it, and again we understand he cared very little for his birthright. Therefore, when Esau took Canaanite wives, his mother Rebekah described Esau's wives as a grief of mind. Also, that if Jacob did the same as Esau and took Canaanite wives as well, her life would have been for nothing. So ultimately, Jacob obeyed his parents' wishes and took her brother's daughters as wives, who were pagans. Clearly, the problem was not belief, but race. So So now we get to the important part, the blessings for both sons. The whole world would revolve around these two blessings. So where Isaac blesses his sons, firstly Jacob, he gives him the dew of heaven, the fatness of the earth, and plenty of corn and wine, that people would serve him, and nations bow down to him, and even his mother's sons, so that's Esau, would bow down to him. So ultimately, Jacob would rule the world. Esau, however, got a different blessing. Now the King James completely screws the translation up, so I'll use the NASB. Behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of heaven and above, and by your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But it shall come about when you become restless, that you will break his yoke from your neck. So this meant the Israelites would come to rule over their brother, but at some later point in future, the situation would be reversed. So let's look through history. When the Israelites invaded the land of Canaan and claimed the land, they came to rule over the descendants of Jacob's brother. And much later, after the Israelite deportations, even with the two peoples merging, becoming the Judeans, the Romans ruled over them, and the Romans were Israelites. Then with Europe becoming Christian, the descendants of Jacob's brother, who now claimed to be the Israelites, never were dominant. They were always in the shadows, even forcefully separated and forced to live in ghettos. So to that point, the Israelites had always been the dominant nation of the two. Eventually, however, by the time of the French revolutions and Napoleon, this situation changed and was reversed. The descendants of Jacob's brother were emancipated and given equal status as Christians. From here on, under their banking system and under the guise of democracy spreading to all Christian nations, they became the dominant nations and rule over to us even now. This is the fulfillment of Isaac's blessing upon his son Esau. From here we realize who is Jacob and who is Esau. No other people fit these prophecies. But there's more to the story, and we must take a deeper dive into the Bible. So the descendants of Jacob's brother are also the race of Cain, as Esau had intermarried with the Canaanites, who themselves had intermarried with the Kenites and the Nephilim. So this means that the descendants of Jacob's brother would also inherit any curses upon the race of Cain. And in Genesis 4, Yahweh curses Cain, when thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength, a fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. This means the race of Cain would be a roaming race, going nation to nation, a race of merchants, panderers, con artists, and swindlers. Ultimately, their true power would be international finance and trade. This means usury and banking would be their natural inclination they would always strive towards, and we see this fulfilled in the banking system that enslaves us today. This is the source of power Esau would use to break the yoke from off his neck. The time of Jacob's trouble described in Jeremiah is this time when Esau would come to rule over Jacob. The Israelites, the descendants of Jacob's brother, would try to wipe out the Israelites. Today this is happening with the mass migrations into all of our European nations, and this is described as Satan going out to deceive all nations and gather them against the camp of the saints being the Israelites. Here again we see that the Israelites have come to supplant the Adamic race as a whole, whilst Esau has come to take charge of the Nephilim races to mobilize them against us. Collectively they are all Satan, the adversary to us, the Israelites, but they are led by the descendants of Jacob's brother. Finally, we realize why Christ will return to save his people. To save his people from what, one might ask? From the descendants of Jacob's brother trying to wipe us out. But there is another way of looking at it. Since they are technically also the race of Cain, and Cain killed Abel, they are now trying to wipe out Abel's replacement, Seth, and all his descendants. We are the last remnant of Seth's descendants that remain, and Cain is trying to finish us off once and for all. But in Obadiah we know Yahweh's true intentions, that the house of Jacob will be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. 53. The nature of Esau throughout the New Testament. Upon the prophesied time of the coming of the Messiah, we read of two very different reactions in the New Testament. Firstly, we have a small portion of the Judeans, and particularly the Magi who come to find Christ and are overjoyed at the news. Then we have King Herod and his entourage, who are generally fearful and seek to immediately kill the Christ child. As you read through the Gospels, it becomes clear these people were two separate races living side by side in Judea. The genuine Israelites naturally followed their God, their shepherd, as Christ stated, "My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me." But the impostors, the descendants of Jacob's brother, who were also the race of Cain, feared the coming of Christ and sought to kill him. As Christ stated, "You believe me not, because you are not my sheep." Now, as for those Magi, it's completely overlooked by all mainstream teachings that the Israelites were deported to the east, that the Parthian Empire in the east, from where the Magi came from, were Israelites themselves. The Magi were Israelites, and that is why they knew of the prophecies of the coming of a Messiah, and that is why they were overjoyed at his anticipated coming. Now, Herod's reaction is recorded in Matthew. When Herod heard these things, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And he gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, and he demanded them where the Christ should be born. So from there, Herod had only sought to find and kill the child, and he is also recorded as killing many children in the region when he could not find the specific infant whom he sought. In contrast, we read of the Magi that were departing from Herod to seek the child, and when they saw the star they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they were come into the house, and they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. We then see Herod's reaction. When he saw that he was mocked of the wise man, he was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem. So we have to ask, why would Herod be so troubled, and all Jerusalem with him? Herod by this time had been king for over 30 years. However, his rule was never fully secure due to the circumstances how he was made king. Herod had initially intermarried with the then high priest of Judea, who ruled virtually as a king, and this was obviously done to give his future rulership some legitimacy. Upon there being turmoil between the ever-expanding Roman Empire and Judea, Herod had went behind the high priest back and allied with the Romans, and then later by bribing the Romans he secured himself as king over all of Judea. Herod then hunted down and killed all relatives of the high priest's family, included Herod's own wife and children. Herod's rulership could therefore be threatened by a so-called coming Messiah, and since Herod had appointed his lackeys, i.e. fellow descendants of Jacob's brother, into all the positions of power, they too would naturally be threatened as well. Thus we understand why Herod and all of Jerusalem were so troubled. Essentially, they were all collectively ruling Judea like a mafia-style crime syndicate. Now, Herod's attempt to kill Christ as a child is also described in Revelation chapter 12. "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon its heads." This relates the satanic entity to the world empires as they are described elsewhere in Revelation and the prophecies of Daniel. "And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was called up unto God and to his throne. This child can be none other than Christ. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she have a place prepared of God, that they should feed her for 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought in his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into earth, and his angels were cast out with him." So in a nutshell, the woman with the 12 stars is the Israelites fleeing to Europe as the Germanic tribes. Europe is described here as a wilderness, as especially the northern parts were rough and uninhabited previously. Herod is described as a dragon trying to kill the Christ. He is also linked to the initial rebellion by the fallen angels thousands of years prior. Herod was descended from Cain, as were all the descendants of Jacob's brother, who descend from the fallen angels who rebelled from Yahweh in the first place. The entity known as the serpent would be the fallen angels collectively, which now continues in their descendants, particularly the race of Cain. Herod, being a mighty king, is therefore described as a dragon. Think of the serpent being a mass race of descendants of fallen angels, with dragon heads leading it. With this understanding, now we can understand various statements by Christ, John the Baptist, and the apostles. When John the Baptist had a confrontation with his adversaries, he warned them that the axe is laid unto the root of the trees. Therefore every tree which bringeth not good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Now which tree could John possibly be referring to? This must be the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is an allegory for the fallen angels and all the corrupt races they had created. John's adversaries were the race of Cain and dust from that tree. So in other words, John was stating they were doomed. Christ also made a similar remark, explaining to the apostles, "Every plant which my heavenly Father have not planted shall be rooted up. Let them alone, they be blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch." Therefore the lines become evident. There are plants which God had planted, and they bring forth good fruit, but there are plants which Yahweh God did not plant, and they shall be rooted up. In other words, Adamites are destined to go to heaven, and the fallen angels with their Nephilim offspring to the lake of fire. Furthermore, since Christ's adversaries were offspring of the fallen angels, the serpent, Christ's comments on vipers can be better understood. "Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell?" He was not calling them serpents, rather he was calling them the offspring of vipers, or that which is produced of vipers. So he was calling their parents vipers, and where generation may have better been translated as race, and hell could be better translated as lake of fire. Finally, with all this in mind, Christ explained how to overcome these adversaries he had faced, and this is where Christ sent out 70 disciples to preach his gospel, and they returned to him. And the 70 returned again with joy, saying, "Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through thy name." And he said unto them, "I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. Behold, I give unto you power to tread unto serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." Not only does this passage describe the enemies of Christ as serpents and scorpions, but it also connects them to the fall of Satan from heaven, which is later described in much more detail in Revelation chapter 12. So when the Apostle Peter had warned in chapter 5 of his first epistle, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil as a roaring lion walketh about seeking whom he may devour," he was talking about the descendants of Jacob's brother. And when the Apostle James warned also in chapter 4 of his epistle, "Resist the devil and he will flee from you," he was also talking about the same race of Cain. Overall, we learn that primarily the adversaries of Christ were the descendants of Jacob's brother, who still are his adversaries today. The only way to overcome them is to obey Christ's commandments, and in addition, with the extra context of Revelation explaining to us that when Babylon falls, i.e. the international e-commerce and trade banking system collapses, and it will eventually, that then we must come out of it and band together as Christians. Furthermore, we know who our adversary is, and that only we as Christians are their target, who they are attempting to eliminate. Like Herod tried to kill Christ, the same people are trying to wipe out his people today. 54. The blessings and curses of Deuteronomy apply only to European Israelites. Today there are all types of people claiming to be the people of the Bible. Some will even argue this based on the blessings and curses of Deuteronomy. However, with even a brief examination of Deuteronomy, it's clear only the European people fit both the blessings and curses. Overall, the Israelites were prophesied after the Assyrian deportations to build a vast Christian civilization and to spread all over the world. But when they began to turn away from Yahweh, to gradually lose that great civilization and be overrun by foreign aliens, this was the conditional promises of both the blessings when they obeyed Yahweh and curses when they disobeyed. No other race or people have fulfilled this. They have neither been blessed and built a great Christian civilization, and neither have they been cursed with mass migration to their nations for turning away from a pre-existing Christian civilization. they built themselves. So all these false adherents claiming to be the people of the Bible have no legs to stand on and are proven to be liars. Firstly, most of our people failed to comprehend the entire scope of the punishments from Yahweh upon his people. When the Israelites were deported by the Assyrians, Yahweh told them that if they would not hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. The short explanation for this is that a time is referring to a year or 360 days. In prophecy, a day is a year, so this is 360 years prophetically. Since it was a 7 times punishment, then it works to be 2,520 years. So when you take the date of the beginning to the Assyrian deportations at around 721 BC and add on those 2,520 years, you come to around 1800 AD, which is the time of the French Revolution, and this was the time of the Age of Liberty. This period of 7 times punishment of 2,520 years is the tribulation. We've already went through it. Most Christians believe there's going to be a tribulation far off into the future, not realizing it's already happened. Since our ancestors had demanded an earthly king, we had to live under a king or a tyranny since those deportations for the entirety of the 2,520 years of punishment. First, this was under the empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks and Romans. Then the papacy that came to rule over all Europeans. Furthermore, we've always had kings and nobles ruling over us. These empires are all prophesied to come and go in the book of Daniel, yet the other races and peoples out there were not tyrannized by these empires, nor by the papacy, neither by kings and nobles. So how can they possibly be the Israelites of the Bible? Now, the Age of Liberty overlaps with many prophecies. The important thing is the tyrannies would be removed and we would be free to govern ourselves. However, at the same time, our adversaries would also be freed as Napoleon emancipated them. So we have failed miserably. Rather than ruling ourselves, we have become ruled over once more, this time by the race of Cain under their banking system. We are actually far worse off than we were under the nobles, the kings, and even the papacy. There is no freedom or liberty except in Christ. If all of our people fear God and obey His commandments, this is the only way to maintain a free civilization, and that is the lesson here. Now for the blessings of Deuteronomy. We will just pick the first few as it makes it immediately clear only the Europeans fulfill them. Firstly, to be elevated above all people if we hearken diligently upon the voice of Yahweh and observe and obey His commandments, then will we be on high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings would come upon thee. So under King David, the Israelites were elevated above all surrounding nations, and as Christian Europe, we Israelites were once again elevated above the whole world, creating an extraordinary civilization unparalleled across the world. As for our cities, cattle, crops and produce, blessed shalt thou be in the city, and blessed shall be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of the body, and fruit of the ground, and fruit of the cattle, and the increase of thy kind, and the flocks of thy sheep. Blessed shall be the basket and thy store. We have always been food exporters with everything we need in abundance. Our cities are beautiful, and we have exceeded every previous empire and civilization ever to exist. Now our armies and military might. Blessed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and blessed shalt thou be when thou goest out. Yahweh shall cause thine enemies that rise up against thee to be smitten before thy face. They shall come out against thee one way and flee before thee 7 ways. So just an example, the British Empire alone, with a mere army size of 250,000, ruled over 20% of the entire world. Other European nations have also always dominated wherever they went. Finally, to be feared and His people, Yahweh shall establish thee an holy people unto Himself, as He hath sworn unto thee. If thou shalt keep the commandments of Yahweh thy God, and walk in His ways, all the people of the earth shall see that thou art called by the name of Yahweh, and they shall be afraid of thee. European Christendom was feared as we spread across the world. The other peoples marveled and feared us. With these blessings alone, when in history were any other people set above the rest of the world? All other peoples are all food importers. They have never had food and cattle in abundance. As for their cities, only recently with the injection of Western technology, usually with German engineering, have they managed to be built up to our standards. Have they ever been great Christian people feared across the world, it's obvious the other peoples in the world have never enjoyed any of these blessings, so when examining the evidence by claiming to be the people of the Bible, they fall flat on their faces. Now we shall go over the curses. Again, there is a huge list of curses, so we will just cover a few. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of Yahweh, to observe all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee. Cursed shall be the city, cursed shall be in the field, cursed shall be thy basket and thy store. Most of our cities have been overrun, unsafe, with no-go zones. Crime has got out of control, and this is only recently with us Europeans turning away from Yahweh and aliens flooding our towns and cities. As for our food, cursed shall be the fruit of thy body and the fruit of the land, the increase of thy kine and the flocks of thy sheep. Our food is now full of pesticides and other toxic chemicals. Our cattle and animals are filled with growth hormones, and who knows what else. It is hard to tell what you're even eating anymore. We have lost control of our own food supplies and are paying dearly for it. As for our health, Yahweh shall make the pestilence cleave unto thee until he has consumed thee from off the land, when thou goest possess it. Yahweh shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with inflammation, with an extreme burning, and with the sword, and with blasting, and with mildew, and they shall pursue thee until thou perish. We have all types of cancers and diseases that never even existed until recently, and this is likely due to all the poisoning in our waters and food supplies. Finally, as for our military power, Yahweh shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies, and thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways. Thou shalt be removed in all the kingdoms of the earth, and thy carcass shall be meat upon the fowls of the air, and unto the beasts of the earth, and no man shall fray them away. Our armies, navies, and air forces have become pitiful and a joke. Our men are weak and effeminate. Of course, this is all by design, by the propaganda of our enemies. There are many more blessings and curses that could be listed. Regardless, to claim to be the Israelites, you have to have enjoyed the blessings and have been a great Christian civilization to prove it. Since only Europeans had ever been Christians, this immediately disqualifies all other people. Anyone can claim to be suffering or under some form of curse, but how does that prove anything? As for the peoples who have flooded our lands and now enjoy all our benefits and luxury, for them to claim to be the people of the Bible because they have life good now is absurd. They only deceive themselves. They fail to realize they are a temporary curse from Yahweh to punish us, the Europeans, and have come here to devour us. This all serves as a purpose to make Yahweh's people repent and turn back to him. We pray that this day comes soon. 55. Jacob and Moses' blessings for the 12 tribes. When Jacob was old and about to die, he gathered his 12 sons and blessed them. Some of these blessings were fulfilled in the children of Israel living in the land of Canaan, but many were not. They must have been fulfilled later in history, and the European people fulfilled them. Furthermore, Moses also gave blessings upon the 12 tribes, and in the same fashion some of these were fulfilled soon, but others were far off in the future and must be the Europeans. These blessings included spreading across the world, building a vast multitude of nations, having armadas encompassing all the oceans, and to have everything in abundance. None of the other peoples in the world fulfill even one of these blessings, so it should be plainly obvious the Europeans are the 12 tribes. We shall focus on the most clearly identifiable blessings. The most notable blessings are those bestowed on Joseph. Jacob called Joseph to him and blessed Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob made his 2 grandsons his firstborn, where he said, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt, before I came unto thee in Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. Typically a firstborn son would receive a double portion above the other sons, and we see this in the blessing. Bless the lads, and let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. So Ephraim and Manasseh would be a multitude of nations. Jacob swapped the order around, putting Manasseh the oldest second, and Ephraim the younger first. Jacob blesses Manasseh, saying he shall be great, meaning a single great nation, And as for Ephraim, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. So can these two brothers be identified in history? Ephraim's company of nations can only be the British Empire, which at its height ruled 20% of the landmass of the world, whilst Manasseh can only be America, which is the single great nation Jacob prophesied. Both nations at their time surpassed all other European nations, and this would be that double portion the brothers inherited above the other sons. No other peoples in the world have ever formed a company of nations, or a single great nation. If we can identify two tribes within a portion of the European people, then the other tribes must be the rest of the European people. So Reuben and Simeon had lost their birthright. Reuben had slept with his father's concubine, and Simeon had taken vengeance upon the Canaanites. Levi, however, did get a blessing, and that was the Levitical priesthood. Amongst the early European colonies, particularly the Celtic nations, there was a class of people known as the Druids. The Druids operated as a priesthood in a very similar fashion to the Levites in the land of Canaan, and they must be one and the same. Thus, wherever the Israelites colonized in Europe, they also brought their Levitical priesthood with them. Eventually, the Druids only remained in Britain and then converted to Christianity. Judah received the rulership and kingship over the other 12 tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. Wherever they went, whatever nations or colonies they formed, they would be ruled over by the descendants of Judah. Initially, this was fulfilled in Greece and Anatolia, with the Trojans and surrounding Israelite colonies taking Trojan princes to rule over them. Later, the Trojans became the Romans and gradually came to rule the whole world. And in the land of Canaan, David's line ruled over Israel and then the southern kingdom. After the deportations, the Israelites migrating to Europe, and under the Germanic kings eventually conquered Europe. Thus the Germanic nobles and kings came to rule all of Europe, and from there the entire world. So Judah has always ruled over the children of Israel wherever we have been. Now we are ruled over by the bankers, and we await Christ's return to reclaim that rulership. As for the other tribes, their prophecies are less specific. Nevertheless, there are some which are clearly identifiable, such as the tribe of Dan. The tribe of Dan were to leave the name Dan as a trail wherever they went. We see this first in the Danaan Greeks, who appeared in Greece around the time of the Exodus. These must be the Israelites from the tribe of Dan. With the Israelites migrating to Europe as the Germanic tribes, many of the rivers were renamed with the Dan suffix, and eventually the nation known as Denmark was formed, meaning Mark of Dan. Furthermore, the entire region, Scandinavia, is named with the Dan suffix. There are no non-European regions called Dan, so once again, if Dan is in Europe and are white, so must be the other tribes of Israel. Whilst we could try and guess every blessing's fulfillment throughout history, even trying to identify every European nation with a particular tribe, the important thing is, if we can identify even a few in the European people, then we must realize the rest of the blessings must at some point in history also have been fulfilled in the European people. In other words, the Europeans are collectively the 12 tribes who came from those 12 sons which Jacob blessed. 56. The monarchy and nobility of Europe are the rulers of Judah. Judah received the rulership and kingship over the other 12 tribes. Judah was told, "The rulership shall not depart from Judah." This means through history there must have been descendants of Judah always ruling over portions of the children of Israel. King David, a descendant of Judah, did not rule over Israel for many centuries after this prophecy. So where did this perpetual rulership happen prior to David? The answer is Judah had twin sons, Perez and Zerah. Through them we have two parts which manifested throughout history. Zerah's descendants primarily broke away from the main body of Israelites very early on, as early as the Exodus. They became ruling dynasties in Greece and Anatolia, most famously the Dardanians and Trojans. From here the legendary kingdom of Troy was formed. The surrounding nations in those regions also took princes from the Trojans to rule over them. Thus the early nobility and ruling class were descended from Judah in those regions long before King David was even born. And with the sacking of Troy and the Trojans fleeing to Italy, becoming the Romans eventually eventually rose up to rule the world. We see that the Zara branch of Judah did indeed have their turn in ruling over a portion of the children of Israel, their family, as well as the world. On the other hand, Perez's line came to rule over the Israelites in the land of Canaan through King David and his line of descendants. After the deportations, the Israelites, now known under different names such as Cimmerians and Scythians, once again came to be ruled over by kings. These kings must have been descended from David, and eventually the Germanic tribes from the Scythians and Cimmerians came to rule the whole world under their kings and nobles. Here once again Judah continued to rule over the 12 tribes as prophesied, and we see a perfect fulfillment of Judah's prophecies in the Europeans once again. But there is yet another prophecy which is generally completely overlooked by mainstream Christians, and that is the curse upon the house of David. David had taken another man's wife as his own wife, even sending that man to die in battle, and as a result Yahweh had cursed his house. The sword shall never depart from the house of David. This means there would be continuous wars between his descendants, that no single dynasty would ever last forever. Kings would always usurp other kings, and we see this exact fulfillment in the European nobility and the constant strife between the kings and nations. Of course, there was also the race of Cain, the nefarious bankers in the background, encouraging these wars, loaning money at usury to both sides to take full advantage of the wars and to enrich themselves. This gradually led to them being able to destroy the kings and nobilities completely and to come to rule over us, the Europeans themselves. The process took many centuries and was gradual, but really kicked off with the French Revolution, where the French nobility were removed. This process then began to rapidly spread to all other European nations, and gradually the former ruling class was dissolved and democracy replaced it. This is the time of Jacob's trouble. So whatever you think of the former nobilities, even if you despise them, they were Europeans ruling over other Europeans. In other words, our own people with our own rulers. And since the time of their removal, gradually slimy politicians have come to rule over us instead. Many, if not the majority of them now, likely not being of European descent. In Revelation, we see that Christ has the keys to David. This implies that eventually the house of David would fail. They would lose their rulership over the Europeans, and today they certainly have. Nevertheless, Christ would maintain the keys as he is alive and now the last remaining heir to Judah. Christ will return to reclaim that position of king over his people, over all Europeans, since he is descended from David. He is our kindred race and the rightful ruler of his people. No other peoples across the world have had long lines of kings just as the Europeans. Neither have they had Christian kings to rule over them. The kings and nobles of Judah ruled over the Europeans, and the Europeans are the Israelites. 57. The parallel between the Druids of Europe and the Levitical priests. Levi received the family priesthood over the other 12 tribes. Levi's descendants would teach the law, perform the sacrifices, be the judges, and in many ways run the infrastructure of the kingdom. In addition, there was a high priest descended from Aaron who would have authority over the other Levitical priests. Levi was not to have his own territory, rather his descendants were to be scattered within Israel. Whilst they were awarded their own cities, they would also live amongst the other Israelites as their priest and other duties. From the Exodus onwards in 1450 BC for the next 400 years to the end of the Judges period, the Levitical priesthood generally ran the kingdom, with a judge rising up from time to time to aid Israel against their enemies. From the time of King Saul and David onwards, in 1050 BC roughly, a king ruled over the land of Israel. Therefore, if we examine the new Israelite colonies that were being formed during these various periods, we should expect to see a similar social structure formed. So if the Israelites sailed across the known world at the time and formed new nations, would they not bring Levites with them? In the early colonies formed during this period, such as Iberia, i.e. Spain, Gaul, i.e. France, and the British Isles, we see this. Generally, these early nations are referred to as the Celtic nations, and these nations had a special class of people called Druids. The Druids operated in a very much the same fashion as Levites. They taught the laws, memorized history, recorded genealogies, acted as judges, performed sacrifices, and every other duty the Levites were expected to perform form. The Druids in Britain are even recorded as having an archdruid who, just like a high priest, ruled over the other Druids. Naturally, this is exactly what you would expect from the very earliest colonies from the Israelites. With the rise of the Roman Empire and aggressive expansion into Western Europe, Druidism was not favoured by the Romans. Druidism encouraged an immortal spirit within man that lived on, making the Iberians, Gauls and Britons fearless in battle. Furthermore, the Romans desired to set up their own religion across all the territory they gained. Therefore, Druidism was outlawed and the Druidic class was slaughtered and purged. However, in Britain, the Druidic class remained and the British Isles became the last bastion of refuge for Druids. It is likely this which motivated the continuous push by the Romans to conquer the British Isles. Eventually, with Christianity spreading as early as 35 AD to the British Isles, a gradual shift began to happen from Druidism to Christianity. Since Druidism was technically just a Levitical priesthood who did believe in a coming Messiah, it should not be surprising that the Druids accepted Christianity with open arms. The Druids became the bishops and priests in Christian Britain. 3 archbishops were formed to administer the faith. Therefore, Druidism didn't just mysteriously vanish or disappear, rather it converted to Christianity. Christian Britain had a far larger role in Christianity than most people realize. It was Constantine from within Britain who seized control of the Roman Empire. Constantine had been raised a Christian by his mother Helen, and Constantine made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. Thus, without Britain, it is debatable if the Roman Empire would ever have truly become Christian. But without the Druids in Britain so willingly converting to Christianity and preaching the faith across Britain, perhaps Britain may not have become Christian. Constantine may have never been raised Christian. Regardless, the Levites were in Europe as the Druids, but the Levitical priesthood was done away with in Christ. It had its place and purpose in our history. Peter, speaking to the Europeans, quoted Moses, who was speaking to the Israelites, that we are a royal priesthood, a holy race. Today every man should be a Christian priest of his own household, and above every man should be Christ. In other words, we should all be Christians. 58. Following the paths taken by the tribe of Dan throughout Europe. Dan did not receive a blessing such as a kingship or priesthood like his elder brothers, but by carefully reading the blessings he did receive, we can identify where his descendants went and ultimately who they became. His descendants became the Danaan Greeks, which came from the main body of Israelites during the Exodus. They became the Danaans in Ireland, known as the Tuatha De Danann, and most famously they became the Danes in Denmark and Scandinavia. In the early Greek classical literature, Diodorus Siculus mentions a Moses leading his people, the Israelites, out of Egypt during the Exodus into a region called Judea, but that some Israelites sailed to Greece and Anatolia instead. Danaeus tells us this breakup portion of Israelites were led by Danaeus and Cadmus. This Danaeus is said to have led his people, the Danaans, to Achaia, a region in Greece, where they built the city Argos, which he said was the oldest city in Greece. Therefore, in Homer's stories, the Danaans, who fought the Trojans, who were another branch of the Israelites, are interchangeably also called Achaeans after Achaia and Argives after Argos. These people, including the famous Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, and others, were all Israelites from the tribe of Dan. It is likely that Danaeus is actually based on the patriarch Dan. Of course, Dan would be long dead by the time the Danaans left Egypt. Thus, the histories and timelines recorded by Diodorus are slightly confounded. Nevertheless, they are based on the truth. The island of Sardinia was also settled by the Danaans, and this we can tell by the name of the island, as Sardinia comes from Shardania, which in Hebrew is 2 words combined, Shar, which means remnant, and Dan, referring to the people of Dan. The end suffix of IA simply means a country or nation, so the nation of the remnant of Dan is what Shardania means. Over time, the name got simplified to simply Sardinia, which the island is still called to this day. In the earliest Irish myths and legends, a people called the Tuatha De Danann are said to have settled Ireland. Tuatha De Danann literally means tribe of Dan. Can it get any more clearer than that? Thus the tribe of Dan did indeed spread far and wide, from Greece and reaching as far up to Ireland. We see here that the descendants of Dan maintained the name Dan wherever they went. Interestingly, this was all part of a prophecy. Modern historians, however, call the Danaan Greeks the Mycenaean civilization, and they insist that Tuatha does not mean tribe. All of this is to obscure the truth that the Danaans and other Israelites migrated to Europe and became the Europeans. Now as for Dan's blessings, Dan was prophesied to leave a trail. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path. Furthermore, Moses prophesies, Dan is a lion's whelp, he shall leap from Bashan. This implies Dan would be restless, not satisfied with their territory in the land of Canaan, and continuously be migrating. These movements would leave a trail of their travels like a serpent's path. The snake, as it slithers along the ground, leaves a clear identifiable trail in the ground. In the same manner, Dan's descendants would do this by leaving signs and waymarks throughout their travels and the migration routes they followed. In other words, they would name the places they traveled and settled in after their patriarch, such as we've seen with Sardinia. We see an example of this during the Judges period, where 600 Danites with weapons of war went up north and pitched in the city Kiriath Jearim. The Danites then went on to destroy the city Laish, and they renamed the city to Dan after their father, their patriarch Dan, even though the city was called Laish at first. This renaming of places to Dan would continue all throughout Europe. Denmark, the name of the modern country in Europe, literally means Dan's mark, Dan's land, or Dan's last resting place. Its people are called the Danes. According to their legends, they originated from a patriarch called Dan, and the first king allegedly to rule over a united Denmark was called Dan, as well as later kings also were named Dan. Thus Jacob's prophecy was fulfilled. The tribe of Dan named places after their ancestors Dan, wherever they traveled to. Now the other prophecies are also significant. Firstly, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel indicates that Dan would be somewhat autonomous from the rest of Israel, ruling over and judging themselves, and this certainly was fulfilled with the early Danaans breaking away to form their own nations in Greece and the rest of Europe. However, Scandinavia has also generally remained autonomous from the rest of Europe, not to be conquered or ruled over by other European nations. Thus Dan did judge his people, his own people. In addition to being a viper's trail, Dan would also biteth the horse's heels so that his rider shall fall backwards. By looking at the history of the Viking raids from Scandinavia, which encompassed all of Europe, we do indeed see that Dan's continuous raids caused the European nations to fall backwards. This, however, had a united effect on those nations and forced them to Christianize, to unify, to defeat the invaders. One such an example is Alfred the Great, who from the Kingdom of Wessex managed to unite virtually all of England together as a Christian nation to oppose the Danes. The final prophecy, I have waited for thy salvation, Yahweh. This is clearly the long wait the Danes had in converting to Christianity. Scandinavia was one of the last people and nations in Europe to Christianize, as late as 1000 AD approximately. Thus from the early Danites breaking away from the Israelites, or even from the Assyrian deportations of 721 BC, it took over 1700 years for them to return to Yahweh, their God, in Christianity. Thus they waited for thy salvation a very long time. The tribe of Dan did indeed leave their mark in history all across Europe. We can trace their paths and know that they are in Scandinavia right now. Of course, they would be spread in all other European nations as well. By looking at Danes, we can tell what the Israelites and the other tribes look like. They were white and they are the Europeans. 59. The prophecies about the Israelite Phoenicians in Europe. The Phoenicians were the Israelites who colonized enormous parts of Europe. They were primarily from the northern tribes of Israel, and many of the blessings on the northern tribes make it clear they would be colonizing Europe. In other words, the Phoenicians are the Israelites. So to divert away from this and cover this simple fact up, modern historians claim the Phoenicians were Canaanites, and therefore the colonists in Europe must be Canaanites. Thus the entire narrative of history is reversed. We are taught to believe Europeans are Canaanites, and the modern people claiming to be the Israelites are genuine. In reality, they are the Canaanites. Let us put this into perspective and see how ridiculous ridiculous this notion is. Under the false narrative, we are supposed to believe that after Joshua's invasions, where the Israelites had conquered all of the land of Canaan, they simply never occupied the coast or the port cities, they just left them to the Canaanites. This is absurd. Part of the confusion may be attributed to the fact that the Israelites sailing abroad from the coasts were called Phoenicians instead of Israelites, and this is simply the Greek name given to the seafaring Israelites. The Ionian Greeks, who were descended from Javan, were not fully acquainted with the full history of the Israelites, so the Phoenicians used a special purple dye on their sails and clothes, and this dye was only found in the mollusk on the shores of Tyre. Phoenician means purple people, thus we see how the name was born and was unique to the sailing Israelites from the northern tribes with that purple dye. In the book of Joshua and Judges, we learn which tribe gained which territory. So focusing here on the port cities, we learn that Manasseh gained the port city Dor, whilst Asher gained the port cities Tyre, Akko and Sidon. Although initially it states the Israelites did not drive out all the Canaanites, we do learn later in scripture the Canaanites were subjected to bondage, thus the Israelites were the dominant people. Logically, any colonies originating from these port cities would be Israelites. In Dan's territory, they gained the seaport Joppa. In Judges chapter 5, the Israelites had just defeated those same Canaanites, and this is recorded in the Song of Deborah, and she asked a rhetorical question, why did Dan remain in ships? And Asher continued on the seashore and abode in the breaches. Breaches means ports, so here we see that Asher did indeed control the coast and did not partake in the war. Rather, they were busy sailing the Mediterranean as the Phoenicians. Getting back to the port city Tyre, the Bible mentions every city where the Canaanites still remained, but there is never a mention of Canaanites remaining at Tyre. This is significant as Tyre was known as the mother city of the Phoenician colonies. To make things more complicated, Tyre was two port cities, one on the land and the second part on an island just off the coast. That second part, Tyre, according to Josephus, was not built until 240 years before the building of Solomon's temple, and this would work out roughly 1190 BC. In Homer's epic tales around the Trojan War, which occurred around 1200 BC, Homer frequently mentioned the seaport Sidon, but never Tyre, as Tyre had only become a major seaport once the second island part was built. We can understand why Homer never mentions Tyre. Over time, Tyre overtook all other Israelite seaports, becoming the mother city of European colonies. The historian Strabo confirms this. Now, although the poet, that's Homer, have referred more repeatedly to Sidon than to Tyre, as Homer never mentioned Tyre, yet the colonies sent to Libya, that would be Carthage, and Iberia, that's Spain, as far even as outside the Pillars, so that's going outside to the British Isles, hymn rather the praises of Tyre. Thus primarily Tyre, where all the Canaanites were driven out, was the mother city of the European Phoenician colonies. Furthermore, as Josephus stated, the island part was built anew by Israelites, not Canaanites, and only then did it really take off. But there is more that ties the Phoenicians and Tyre together. In ancient history, the early Phoenicians are often synonymous with the legendary Cadmus, known as Cadmus the Phoenician. However, the historian Herodotus specifically called Cadmus the Tyrian rather than merely the Phoenician. Additionally, the famous Phoenician purple dye sought out to be used for royalty and nobility across Europe was also interchangeably called Tyrian purple. The great city Carthage, which grew to rival the might and power of the early expanding Roman Republic, was said to be the daughter of its mother city Tyre. Thus overall, Tyre and the Phoenicians are intimately interconnected. Whilst the Phoenicians no doubt would have sprang from all port cities from the coast of Israel, primarily Tyre was deemed the mother city, and there were no Canaanites in Tyre. Thus the Phoenician colonies were founded by Israelites. The mainstream line, we are told, has no legs to stand on when put under scrutiny. Now we shall examine the blessings upon the northern tribes. Firstly, there is a discrepancy with which tribe inherited the city Tyre. If you look at the 12 tribes' territory, notice that Naphtali has no coastal ports, and this would imply only Asher were the Phoenicians. This is because most Bible translations of the Old Testament Testament, including generally the maps drawn, are based on the Masoretic text, which is the surviving Hebrew versions of the Bible. However, in the Septuagint, which is the surviving Greek version, there are some minor differences to the Hebrew, and one of those is that in the book of Joshua it states that Naphtali gained Tyre, not Asher. So this means both Asher and Naphtali had access to the coasts and port cities, but Naphtali specifically had Tyre. And when we examine the blessings, we will see that this does make sense. Naphtali was blessed to possess the west and the south, and this must be the Phoenician expansion to Carthage and Iberia, which were west and south of Tyre. Since there is an entire Mediterranean Sea in between Tyre and these locations, obviously Naphtali would have to sail to those regions, and it lines up with them being a part of the Phoenicians with the other northern tribes. As for Asher's blessing, it states that he would dip his foot in oil. Now there is clear evidence that the olive trees all across the coast of the Mediterranean Sea originated from the coast of Israel, so the Phoenicians brought them with them and planted them to wherever they colonized. This cannot be denied, as the olive trees are not native to the new locations they were brought to. Modern historians will admit this, but spin it that the Phoenicians were Canaanites. The other blessing was, "Thou shoes shall be iron and brass." Iberia, Spain, was plentiful in iron and brass mines. Thus the Phoenicians certainly did walk over iron and brass in their territory. So here we see Asher would be responsible. In other words, the tribe of Asher was amongst the stock of the Phoenicians along with Naphtali, and the Phoenicians were not Canaanites but Israelites who were blessed to do these great things. Zebulon's blessing was that Zebulon would dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be a haven of ships. But if you look at the 12 tribes' territory in the land of Canaan, Zebulon was not on the coast and had no port city, so this must be a later prophecy to be fulfilled at a later time outside of the land of Canaan. So this must have happened in Europe. Overall, we see the Phoenicians were Israelites from the northern tribes who settled Europe. The Bible shows us the seaports were controlled by Israelites, and the colonies which sprang from these port cities must be Israelites as well. That the blessings upon the northern tribes tell us they would accomplish the colonization of Europe as the Phoenicians did. Modern historians lie to us to hide the identity of our people, but the truth will prevail eventually. 60. Ephraim and Manasseh, a great nation and a company of nations. Joseph received a double portion as a blessing. Typically, it was customary at the time for the firstborn son to receive the rulership, the priesthood, and a double portion as his inheritance. Since Reuben and Simeon had lost their birthrights, the firstborn inheritance was instead divided between Judah, Levi, and Joseph. Judah and Levi were counted as the eldest sons of Leah, whilst Joseph was the oldest son of Rachel. Therefore, Judah and Levi received the rulership and priesthood, but Joseph's descendants were entitled to a double portion. Initially, we see this in Joseph's descendants becoming not one tribe, but two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. They were his sons and gained an individual inheritance each. So instead of 12 tribes, technically it is 13 tribes, even if Ephraim and Manasseh both came from Joseph. But the prophecy also indicated at some point in the future, Ephraim and Manasseh would gain a double portion of territory. This was not fulfilled in the land of Canaan, but there is more to the story of simply a double portion. When Joseph was young, he had a dream of his brothers bowing down before him. This dream was fulfilled when he became second only to the Pharaoh in Egypt, and his other brothers came to Egypt. However, this is also a dual prophecy and must also be fulfilled later in the future. Joseph's descendants, Ephraim and Manasseh, would one day be elevated above the other tribes. This did not happen in the land of Canaan. Both Joseph's dreams and the double portion were fulfilled in the British Empire and America, which surpassed all the other European nations. So Joseph's dream would have been around 1800 BC approximately. The dream took an astonishing 3,600 years approximately to be fulfilled in the Great British Expansion and the rise of America. But there is more evidence to consider. In Moses' blessing to Joseph, he prophesied that Joseph's descendants would push the peoples, that must be the Israelites, to the ends of the earth. This must again be the British Empire, which with its maritime power came to dominate and control all the seas of the world. And with this naval power, the British Empire put a stop to piracy and policed the waves, which largely facilitated the mass migrations and colonization of Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as well as other major European colonies all across the world. Additionally, in Jacob's blessing, Joseph was foretold to be a fruitful tree by a well, whose branches run over the well, indicating his territory could not contain him and he would spread abroad and branches would stretch to new colonies. This is the British Isles spreading to America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand amongst other places. Whilst the Dutch, French, Spaniards and Portuguese may have been formidable competitors of the English in colonial times, their settlements which they managed to establish did not develop into nations as notable or powerful as those of the British. Interestingly, as for the name England and English, it originated from the name Angles, which was one of the tribes that settled England, along with the Saxons and Jutes. Prior to their coming, the Cymry, the Phoenicians, and possibly a Trojan presence had dominated the British Isles, all of which were also descended from the Israelites. The Hebrew word Egal, Strong's 5695, means calf, and this is likely the origin of the name Angles, as well as the Angus cow. Amongst the 12 tribes, Ephraim's symbol was the bull. Understanding that the British fulfill prophecies of Ephraim, it should be no surprise that a tribe named the Bull settled in England. If England originated from Angles, and the name Angles originated from calf or bull, then England means land of the bull, and the English the people of the bull. In other words, land and people of Ephraim. Finally, there is one aspect of the story of Joseph and the future British Empire in America to consider. Joseph was responsible for empowering the Pharaoh of Egypt. When there was a famine, Joseph suggested that the Pharaoh take the property of the people in exchange for feeding them, and this resulted in the Pharaoh becoming incredibly powerful, gaining the entire Egyptian resources to himself. Joseph did not foresee that one day in the future a powerful Pharaoh may turn on his people, and a few generations later this is exactly what happened. The Pharaohs began to fear the Israelites and sought to kill them all. Under the British Empire, the British came to largely dominate the entire resources of the world. However, in reality, the nefarious bankers, the race of Cain, were largely in control of the British Empire behind the scenes. They set up the Bank of England, which was a usury central bank which came to dominate the British Empire, but also largely Europe as well. They used this bank to finance the companies set up abroad all across the British Empire's territories, and later America followed in similar steps. Again, the race of Cain made several attempts at setting up a central bank, eventually fully succeeding with the Federal Reserve in 1913, and this central bank has been used to enslave the whole world. Therefore, the mighty British Empire and American Empire have followed in their ancestors Joseph's footsteps. Whilst they enjoyed a double portion and extraordinary blessings, they have unwittingly aided the race of Cain in enslaving us all. So just like Joseph aided the Pharaoh, not realizing later the Pharaohs would turn on his people, the bankers under this beast system of international trade and e-commerce have turned on us and are now trying to destroy the European people. This is the exact circumstance described in Revelation, where firstly the woman flees into the wilderness. The woman is the children of Israel fleeing to Europe. She is a woman because Yahweh divorced the children of Israel, so the woman is no longer his wife. However, he promises to later remarry her again at the end of Revelation. For now, the woman is nourished by Yahweh, which is Christianity, his gospel. Then only a few chapters later, the woman has turned into a whore and joined with the beast. This is us, the Europeans, who are starting to abandon Yahweh's Christianity and join to the race of Cain's international trade and e-commerce. Additionally, Revelation tells us that the beast hates the woman, and this is the race of Cain using our own resources to destroy us. Every policy in our nation has been turned against us. Ultimately, just like in Egypt, where Yahweh saved his people, the same thing will happen again, this time with Yahweh returning as Christ to once again save his people from our own mess we have gotten ourselves into. Then he will remarry us, his bride, the European people, and this is the supper of the Lamb in Revelation, once all his enemies have been destroyed once and for all.